I don't know the solution to that problem, but if somebody comes up with it, it's worth a few trillion dollars.
And hopefully not just better drugs.
Somebody's always promising a technology that gets rid of developers, but it's never happened. The only thing that ever really happens is that developers work at higher and higher abstraction levels. It's really just creating a lot of slop out there, and it's making the internet less useful for everyone, which is sad. And hopefully, we find ways to do something about it.
All right, welcome everyone to Enki Secrets and Stories. Today's guest is Bob Ippolito. He's an experienced CTO, an entrepreneur, and one of the most reputable developers in Silicon Valley. He has deep expertise in building startups and internet scale systems, and he co-founded multiple successful companies, Mochi Media. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, by the way, Bob, and Peaceable Software, which were both acquired, right? I think Peaceable by Facebook. And
Mhm.
now you're on the board of the board share mission bit, the nonprofit empowering youth of color with computer science education for free. Welcome to the show, Bob. How's it going?
Great. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Cool. So I want to set the stage before we get started on what the conversation is going to be about. So what we want to explore is why learning to code matters and how to approach it, as well as covering some technical topics that are interesting for beginners and non-beginners, and insights for starting out or some coding nuances, especially in the age of AI. And I guess whether you're technical or not, it should be something for everybody. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right, cool. So I guess to get started, I think we should talk about what sparked your initial interest in coding and what kind of got you on this path.
I got started programming very young. We had an Atari console in the house, and my grandparents had a computer with a few games on it. I was just really excited about games when I was, I don't know, 2, 3 years old. And one of my motivations for learning to program was that I wanted to make games. I wanted to know how they worked. And I actually learned how to read and write at a young age because I wanted to play King's Quest by myself. Back
Hmm.
then, you could move the character around with the arrow keys, but the rest of the game was prompting the character what to do. So it's just one step beyond the text adventures.
Were you sort of reverse engineering the games, like trying to figure out how did this happen? How were you kind of tinkering and building them?
Well, initially, it was less of a reverse engineering thing. That would have taken quite a bit of expertise at the time, especially with the console stuff. So, I mean, that was more electrical engineering than software at that point. But back in those days, you could get magazines, like science magazines would have code listings for like very basic games in them, so you could type into your computer, and I found that fun. So that was kind of how I got started, copying these examples and modifying them to do other things and learning how it worked just from example.
Got it. But what about, what kept you? You stayed with it for a while. What kept you motivated? Why are you doing this?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say exactly, but I think it's the combination of it being creative, like I get to make things, and also solving puzzles. Like I like to solve puzzles, and programming is the combination of creating things and solving puzzles, or at least the kind of programming that I enjoy doing. So I think that's what's kept me going for the past few decades.
Hmm. Do you remember any early, because programming it's very counterintuitive to to us humans, and I guess especially your first language that you learn, it gets easier over time, but that first time is sort of like speaking to an alien a little bit. I'm just wondering, do you remember, especially in the beginning, what were the big hurdles or anything that was maybe standing out as unusual?
Oh, I mean, there were so many hurdles when I was getting started in the late 80s, early 90s. There wasn't an internet to speak of outside of the military and some universities. So access to information and tools was very hard to come by. I was fortunate that my father worked for IBM, not doing programming, but I had access to computers through him. My grandfather worked at RCA and did some programming with his work on space shuttles and antennas. I could rely on him to teach me the ropes a little bit when I was just first learning basic. The rest of it was really just going to the library, logging on to local dial-up BBSs and trying to find stuff. It wasn't until middle school, high school, where it was easy enough to get on the internet where I could more quickly find things like Linux and open source compilers. But in the early days, you kind of had to just know people or otherwise have access. Like maybe you were going to school for it in university, because there certainly wasn't anything at the high school or elementary school level aside from maybe like a logo workshop.
How old were you, Bob, when you realized that maybe you can actually make money or build a career out of what initially was just curiosity and hacking and building games? How old were you when you thought maybe this is a real thing, it's something I can actually build a career from?
I had my first internship when I was 16 in high school through somebody I met on IRC who worked at Bethesda Softworks, a gaming company local to where I grew up. I managed to get her to get me an interview there for an internship, and the internship turned into a job when I was still in high school. So it didn't really require a lot of thinking. Like I just wanted to try working with computers, and my first job was an internship working with computers. I've been programming ever since.
What about so one thing that's ubiquitous about coding is that people find it intimidating. Your starting point is a different age of computing than today. So I'm curious, both in like, do you have any like timeless advice for someone who feels intimidated that would apply in either era, but also relevant to today? Now we have Stack Overflow, we have ChatGPT, we have a bunch of stuff. So do you have any advice for someone who's intimidated to get started?
I think the best thing you can do to get started is to find a problem that you want to solve that involves some sort of automation or something that programming is the right solution for, and also find out how to make it small enough in scope that you don't have to learn everything, right? Like if you want to make games, maybe try and make chess or checkers rather than an MMO as your first project. So if you can find something you're interested in, that's kind of the motivation to learn, then that's really helpful. Like everything that I learned because I was trying to solve a problem. I wasn't really learning it for its own sake for the most part.
Do you think it's, what's the balance between theory and projects? What's your like philosophy on that?
Well, I think that theory is great, at a foundational level. Like it's very important to have the theory to know what works or what doesn't, especially at scale. But as an individual learner, I think that theory only makes sense after you have a little bit of hands-on experience with the application. I mean, similarly, if you're learning mathematics in elementary school, you learn how to add and subtract. You don't start with the set theory foundations of mathematics. You don't even concern yourself with that unless you're a math major 20 years later. And I think the same is true for computing. You should really start with the things that you want to do and focus on the application of it. Then you should get to the theory once you have a little bit of intuition about it, a set of problems you're trying to solve, and it seems like maybe there's something connecting all of these. I should learn a bit more. And I think that's a great reason to dive into the theory. I think you should have some problem-driven motivation to learn the theory rather than starting with the theory, because I find it very hard to be motivated to get very deep into something theoretical if I'm not also applying it at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's commonly, I would agree, just more dry to kind of read stuff. It's much better when you get to kind of test it and see a reaction. There's like feedback, right? Yeah. How important do you think is having a mentor through this process early on?
I think it's incredibly important, or at least high leverage, to have a mentor, because it can be speaking from experience, very slow if you don't have the resources to help you answer questions. You can spend days or weeks working on a problem when a little bit of guidance could have allowed you to make progress in minutes or hours. On the other hand, struggling through it, you can learn a lot along the way. So there are definitely pluses and minuses. I think having a mentor is incredibly useful, but you shouldn't rely on them for every single question that you have. You should do a little bit of exploration on your own, and then when you're truly stuck, I think that's the right time to seek out expertise from a mentor, whether that's a person or an AI agent.
Yeah, I guess it's easy to be sometimes maybe the downside is it can become like a crutch almost, where you sort of fall back to always asking the questions versus kind of pushing forward to try to struggle more and solve it. So in terms of specific technologies when you're getting started, there's a lot today and some are more popular. I'm just wondering if somebody was asking you for advice, what you want to achieve. But I think a lot of times beginners aren't sure. They kind of just want to become a dev or get into this field. They don't have super specific goals necessarily that would imply some specific technologies. So what would you recommend generally if somebody asks you, like, what should I learn? What's the highest leverage kind of skills to learn as a beginner?
Well, I think it's just awfully hard to learn if you don't have a goal that's a little more concrete than like, I want a job, right? And I don't know too much about the current job market, but web development skills are eternally useful. Everybody has a web browser, whether it's on their phone or laptop. The tools for development are fairly beginner friendly. Once you learn how to use them, you can view source on any website and inspect how any website works. So it's very easy to kind of pick apart anything you see in a web browser. Other tools aren't that open. If you have a mobile app, you can't hop into a debugger or like inspect that code. That's all locked down. The same with like desktop apps or games. So I think that if you were to pick something, web development would be a good choice. Spreadsheets could be a good one. It really depends on what you're trying to do and what your goals are. If you are super interested in data, like maybe you want to be a scientist, learning Python and pandas might be more useful to you than building a website. But if you just want to build something, the web is a great place to start. And if you're super into games, maybe like Unity or Game Maker might be the way to go, because building games on the web isn't super easy because the tools just aren't designed for that.
What about in terms of the way to get there? It was mostly one way, just gonna get a degree, but I think in this field, it's self-taught is almost like an equal, I would say it's equal path to getting there. And I'm just wondering, what do you think about that balance? And is there, what's the trade-off? What do you think?
I only have my own experience as somebody who was self-taught. I certainly lean in that direction when I'm hiring. I don't prefer one or the other. At the end of the day, you're going to need to be a self-taught programmer because
right,
everything changes so fast that whatever you learned in university, other than the theory, it is going to be different by the time that you're applying it or soon after. There's only one kind of good programmer, and that's a self-taught programmer. But university can be a great way to get started, to build that foundation, because it's kind of built-in community. Like you have the TAs, you have your classmates, the professor. There's all this structure there that you wouldn't have if you were just doing it on your own. And I think that community is really useful. I think university is a great path if it's an option for you and it doesn't cause you too much of a hardship. And the self-taught route can just be really tough if you're not already biased towards that route, if that's not the way that you work, and if you don't have access to mentors or peers.
It requires a lot more of self kind of being driven when you don't have the people around you necessarily to always, because you're struggling together in a group. So that's the benefit. You're sort of get motivated by, okay, it's not me, just me. We're kind of moving along. But yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So
And I guess to that point, the university can also be good for people prone to procrastination because you have deadlines. If you're doing it yourself, you don't have deadlines unless you're doing it for work where you have a project or something. So I'm the kind of person that does procrastinate. If there's no pressure, having the deadlines of university could be a real help if you don't have any other external factors influencing your progress.
yeah, so what about technical skills for developers? What about some technical skills that, let's say you're not necessarily a developer, but you're marketing, you're in ops, you're something, you're tech adjacent, you're somewhere in where tech skills are still useful, which is a bigger kind of area than just developers. What do you think are some concrete skills that would be useful for you to learn that are technical?
I think that the most useful skills to learn are the ones around data. Almost every profession has some situation where you're working with large spreadsheets or survey responses or something where automation can be particularly useful. If you're in sales, like maybe you're trying to do mail merges to generate leads or find leads to do cold outreach, and being able to automate that in some way, typing stuff into LinkedIn search is going to be really useful to you. So learning how to use those tools, whether you're explicitly writing code to do it or directing the tools with something that's roughly equivalent to programming, right? Writing queries or even writing prompts that generate queries are the sort of programming tasks that are going to be high leverage for any profession.
Yeah, so from sheets formulas to maybe SQL to even a little bit of Python, depending on your use case, right?
Exactly.
Let me switch a little bit on the side of teaching people and your experience with that, just to get started in that direction. How do you get things started with a student? What's the first thing you teach them? How do you approach these first steps?
Well, it really depends on what the course happens to be, but generally we start off with some examples of what we're trying to do, just to show them what's possible with the tools, how they work, that sort of thing. Generally speaking, all of the courses that I've helped build and when I'm mentoring somebody, there's always some sort of project. It's project-based learning rather than something very rigid from a book where you just color in the lines. We try and show them what's possible so that they can figure out how to use possible to accomplish whatever they're trying to build in their project.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it's important to keep the scope small. You don't want to try and give them everything all at once. You try and show them smaller pieces that later on they can put them together to make something whole.
Yeah. So would you say that it's better to kind of have it like practical outcome driven versus just here are the keywords of this language. Let's learn them one by one. It's more so let's do something practical, and along the way, let's teach the necessary kind of pieces required for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's definitely the approach that I would take with any sort of beginner intermediate course. There's just too much going on in any environment to start with like here's the entire grammar of this language. You want to start small. But like as an expert, if I'm learning a programming language, maybe I am going to read the grammar first, so I know what all the words are. But I've done this for so long and know so many of them that the practical examples I would just kind of be skipping through because I've seen it before in some other slightly different syntax. I would be more interested in the very specific syntax and semantics for whatever this language or library is. But that's certainly not an approach that would work very well for a beginner.
So for your students, what do you think differentiates the ones that, are quote the best students, the ones that kind of go the furthest? What stands out?
I think there are a lot of different ways that a student can stand out. Like, I mean, the most obvious one is they have some experience already, right? So they're already starting at a different place than the other students. Whether that experience is directly with programming, or maybe they're really good at math and the programming they're doing has something to do with math, so they stumble a lot less. Or the other students that tend to produce really great output are students that have a very clear picture in their head of what they're trying to build, right? So they're very motivated to make progress towards what that picture is, and they might be better than other students at kind of figuring out what the scope of their problem is, rather than just kind of stumbling along because they don't know what they're trying to do at the beginning. But other than that, it's really kind of hard to measure students against each other because there are so many different variables and so many different skills that they're working on, that there's not just one metric for like this student is better than another student.
Yeah, do you think how would you set, I guess maybe if you were a student, or maybe if you were telling a student, like how do you set them up for success? Or how would they set themselves up for success? Like one thing you're saying, what you're mentioning right now is having a more concrete goal. But does anything else, or do you want to say more about that?
In the courses that we have at Mission Bit, one of the things that we use are group projects, which I think helps the students considerably, both find a common goal to work towards, and also it gives them peers to work with so they don't get stuck on their own. We also provide other support to them through like teachers and TAs and other sorts of mentors. So I think that group settings can definitely help, and having that community is really beneficial to anybody, especially when they're first starting out.
Do you think there's any super useful non-technical skills to have to be set up for success or to develop?
Communication is the biggest one. Being able to communicate your thoughts clearly with other people and yourself is without a doubt the most useful skill. Kind of at a higher level and very related is networking, like people networking, relationships. I think those are very high leverage skills for anybody, especially developers.
If you have a large group of learners, is there anyone that really struggles to learn to code, even if they have a let's say they have a clear picture of what they want to do, but they and perhaps everyone else in the class has no relevant direct experience before, they're motivated, but who's more likely to struggle, and then what should they do about it? Because not everyone's equal in terms of how disciplined they are, how excited they are about the goal, right? You might have like 10 people with the same goal, but just like you cared a lot more in games than the other 2 and 3-year-olds, right? Even if they thought about it. You're curious about that. How do you lift all boats outside of the kind of really important things like setting goal, making sure you kind of leverage previous experience, and anything else that could help? I'm also interested in what you can do as a parent with your kids if you want them to be technically minded, more logical, and so on.
I think the people that struggle the most are ones that have a hard time focusing for one reason or another, whether that's something going on outside the classroom or something with their own chemistry that makes it harder for them. I don't think there's any general solution to what works to help somebody that has something going on, but really having the community helps, whether that's their peers or TAs or somebody for them to talk to get advice from, to provide a little nudge to get them back on task. I think that's really all you can do, to just provide support and community for them.
Yeah. I mean, focus is a big thing, right? Because it's, everyone's talking right now. It's the rage of how many people actually have ADHD. My partner has ADHD, so she struggles to focus on a lot of things, and she would kind of struggle to learn to code unless there's a specific structure in place and so on. yeah, maybe assessing and addressing kind of focus issues in a more, I don't know, a more systematic way, nationwide at an earlier age, I think should be done in general, but that's a more general thing.
I don't know the solution to that problem, but if somebody comes up with it, it's worth a few $1 trillion.
And hopefully not just better drugs.
All right. Do you think, I guess I actually want, before we dive into some of these AI questions, which I want to ask, because you had some mentors, like you said, family members. What were some of the best things that they did that kind of helped you? What comes to mind?
I think that the most useful mentors that I had was later on working on open source projects. These were people that are experts in their field that I would have never had access to working for a small local company or just living in the suburbs where I did. And being able to read their code, to ask them questions on IRC and mailing lists, that was a resource I would have never thought possible when I was first starting and asking my grandfather questions every now and again when I was stuck. Um, these communities are out there and you really don't have to pay for them. You just have to be sociable and able to reach out and ask questions, especially if you're providing a value, like contributing to a project. The people that know more are going to be a lot more likely to help you and spend more time with you for free, like review your code for free. And you'll learn so much contributing to open source that you just wouldn't be able to unless you worked somewhere that was doing something really interesting. But that's not an option for everybody, especially if you're not old enough to have a real job, or if working at Meta or Google or wherever isn't in the cards for you yet.
Do you think that valuable, or I guess how valuable do you think that is for beginners to get started with sort of like jumping into some open source projects?
I think it really depends on where you draw the line for beginner. Obviously, if you don't really know what you're doing, it's probably not going to be that useful for you to try and contribute beyond small documentation related things, typos, stuff like that. Certainly, once you have like a very basic understanding of what's going on, there's almost nothing better that you could do than read other people's code. And open source projects are a goldmine of code to read, and it's generally going to be quite high quality depending on the project, of course. But if the project has a decent amount of contributors, then it's sort of like, you know, the above average. Whereas if you're learning strictly from a classroom, then it'll be, you know, the quality of that TA or professor or whoever wrote the assignment, which, you know, may be below industry average.
What do you think now we have this? Because one thing that's valuable is obviously mentorship, but like you said, and then community. Sometimes these things are hard to come by, especially good mentors. There's obviously way more people are learning than there are, great mentors for them. And now we have this new kind of alien mentor that we can work with, right? With this LLM technology and everything. And I'm wondering, how do you think this fits into learning to code in the process, especially early on?
I think it's really going to change quite a lot of things, not so much at a fundamental level, but at a scale level. Like you said, um, these are available to everybody. At least right now, like they're kind of giving it away. They're at this point probably at least as good as most TAs. And the office hours are 24/7, and the door's always open. They're never too busy for you, unless that particular LLM service is down for that hour or whatever. But that's pretty rare. I think it will change the scale. It'll change the economics, right? A lot of approaches right now are very expensive because you need to hire all of those mentors. But if you could have the LLM provide the sort of first tier of mentor support, and then you have, you know, human expertise above that, it's really high leverage because you can have a few really good mentors support way more learners than they could directly if the LLMs are able to provide a first tier of support.
What do you think are the main trade-offs, like the best thing education-wise, and like some of the downsides, of using them?
The biggest downside in my experience is that they always give you an answer without having really any indication of its confidence in that answer. LLMs will be very confidently giving you just wrong information. Like you ask, hey, could you give me the SVG to draw a bike? And it'll just draw something that has like variables named wheel and crankset, but the coordinates will be all over the place, and it won't look anything like a bike because it just doesn't understand it at that level. Whereas a human would draw circles for the wheels and stuff, but they would tell you, like, it would take me a couple hours to figure out what all the coordinates should be and equations to draw the spokes and the triangle and the handlebars. The LLM is like, well, I have a budget of this many computations, and I'm just going to give you whatever fits in that budget, even though it doesn't look like a bike at all. I think that's the worst part about LLMs is you don't know, like, it won't tell you that it's wrong. And if you're starting out, you won't know that it's wrong because you don't know what you're doing, right? So the only thing you can do is be like, hey, LLM, like, you're wrong. How do we fix this? And sometimes that kind of prompt works, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's the cases where you really need a human involved, or just to be very resilient and find other ways of getting to that answer, because the AI is not going to lead you there.
One thing I've noticed, a sort of a funny, realistic consequence of this is that people now tend to open GitHub issues for problems that were hallucinated by the AIs that don't even exist in those software repos, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I've seen reports about APIs that don't even exist.
How do we treat them? Personally, this is my opinion, but you tell me what you think. It's not a human equivalent. It's almost like a, more advanced Google in some way, where you can't blindly trust it, like you said. But how do we approach them and prompting them and talking to them such that we kind of are better set up to make them the most useful?
I think that using them as kind of a search, I think, is the right approach. I treat AI code the same way that I treat Stack Overflow code, and just assume that it's tainted and try and understand it before I do anything with it, because it's usually at best maybe not the current way to do things, because these things get stale. As I'm sure you all know, the technology changes every couple months, especially AI technology. Like, if you ask AI about AI technology, it's only going to tell you about the stuff that it was trained on last year or whatever, right? So it can only get you so far. But I think that something great about AI is that it has a very broad knowledge base. It knows the terminology that people use to talk about these problems. So if you give it a general idea of what you're trying to do, it might start spitting out words that you didn't know before, but are the right words to search for that problem. So it can help you narrow your research, whereas it would be very difficult to figure out what those words are otherwise. A lot of programming has terms that are very hard to search, like very common English words and symbols. AI knows those things and can help you refine your search. But I think that's very right, that it's certainly no replacement for a human, but it is in many cases a much better search engine for solving problems.
One other benefit is that it sort of helps you. There's a lot of moments when you're just kind of stuck and you're like, what now? Like, I tried all I could think of. What do I do now? That happens a lot of times, and especially early on, but I think it happens forever in programming. There's just sometimes where you're just like, why is this not working? It should. And so I think they help a little bit, even if it's a wrong answer, even if their advice is not exactly accurate, the feedback with like an AI helps you get unstuck a little bit. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. But it really also depends on you. Still required to do quite a lot in those situations. You have to be able to judge whether the AI is correct or not. You have to refine those prompts to get there. It doesn't kind of do your job for you. It provides templates and directions that you might not have thought of, at least not at that speed.
How important do you think is this like a system around it? So like ChatGPT is very basic, but in terms of the system around it, in terms of the user interface, in terms of all these extra interactions you can do, it's driven by knowing how to ask good questions. But there's other things we could do. Maybe we could have useful buttons, shortcuts, like various things that you could build around these systems. Like how do you think that makes it better to set them up to be even more useful?
Yeah, of course. I think the ultimate direction that these things are going is that they'll just be integrated into whatever product they're using. I've tried it like, Copilot. I think that's the right mode that you should be using AI with code. Like it should already have all of the context, and it should be able to help you. And in my experience, it wasn't that helpful, but I think for a lot of people, having it there is going to be the right solution rather than having to switch modes and copy paste things. I think it's also hard to copy paste things when you have all of these different modules and files and all this context that it won't have access to with the basic chat GPT interface. Whereas if it was just tied into your editor, that it would be able to access everything, for better or for worse. I mean, there's obviously IP and security concerns when you start sending everything you're doing over the internet.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Having the AI in context of your either if you're writing code or maybe if you're reading lessons and it's in context and kind of can figure out to explain, as you're going and knows who you are, what you kind of want to achieve, maybe your level of experience, anything like that, that they can, the more context that's richer and precise, it can be more useful and practical, right? Have you guys used it in any way for teaching others?
We've been experimenting with it a bit. We haven't deployed it at large across our courses yet. The technology is still quite early. Like I said, it very confidently gives you wrong answers, so it can be hard to use in the classroom without a lot of training. There's only so many hours that we have with these students. At this point, with this level of technology, it's hard to use at the very beginner level. We've also done some intro AI courses, and those are also hard for the same reasons. Like the technology is changing super fast. It's hard to find teachers that can teach this very new technology because they don't understand it particularly well either. And also to have the students use it without really understanding what's going on is kind of marginal utility. But I do really like the approach of the TA bots, like the sort of technology you all have at Enki and what we're starting to see in some university computer science courses where the first line of TA is a bot that's trained on the course material. So it's going to give you relevant answers, and ideally is also trained not to just give you the answer, but to give you the explanation around the answer so that it's not doing all of the coursework for you, but just kind of getting you unstuck.
How do you think it evolves? What's the next iteration of this? Did you have obviously this is kind of hard to tell, but I'm just wondering if anything comes to mind.
I mean, it's not my particular area of expertise or research, so I'm not really even 100% up to date on what the latest models are capable of. The reasoning models are just starting to come out, and I haven't played with those too much. So I wouldn't be the best person to predict what's next. I mean, I would love to have it be more generally useful to give you some sort of qualitative metrics on what its answer is, right? Like right now, it just tells you something. It doesn't say there's a good likelihood that this is a bad answer, and maybe you should ask a different question. That kind of stuff would be super useful to me using it, and I think probably to others too. The the resources that these technologies use right now are just so incredibly high. I would love to see them get a lot more efficient. Um, Even if you have an AI that is giving you good answers all the time, maybe it costs a few pennies to run. Where if you had a different solution, it would cost a millionth of a penny to run. So we're doing things very inefficiently when we throw LLMs at every problem, at least from a resource usage standpoint. If you start processing millions or billions or trillions of data points with AI, maybe the right solution would be to have AI generate code that processes the data instead of having all of the data go into the LLM itself. I think those kinds of things are where I would love to see the research go, right? Like let's say you have some sort of regular document format, like you've got these PDFs of, I don't know, economic reports, and you're trying to extract all the numbers, but the reports are kind of the same every month. It would be better to have an LLM generate code that can read those PDFs and do that analysis using like straightforward techniques than to throw an LLM at every PDF separately. It would take orders of magnitude less time and resources to do that kind of thing. So that would be a really useful area for AI, at least from my perspective.
Thinking about where things are going, Bob, what about folks in college who might be worried that given how quickly AI is improving, will developers even exist? And is it even worth learning to code? What would you tell them, or what would be your thoughts or advice for them?
If you've been around long enough, somebody's always saying that, one reason or another, whether they're calling it 4GL or UML or no code or something, somebody's always promising a technology that gets rid of developers, but it's never happened. The only thing that ever really happens is that developers work at higher and higher abstraction levels, and we're able to just hopefully be more productive, but also solve different classes of problems. And I think this is really no different. It's a very different user interface right now, where you're working more with natural language than with a very rigid grammar. And I think that's interesting, but also kind of hard to learn in its own way, especially with how things change so rapidly in the AI space. I think it's important that anyone starting, or anyone that's in the industry, should keep an eye on these technologies. Once they start to solidify, really start diving in and learn how to use them, because one way or another, these will be tools in our developer toolbox. If you don't know the tools, you're going to have a hard time solving problems or being employed. If you were a diehard Pascal programmer in the 90s and you never learned anything other than Pascal, you probably wouldn't have a lot of options open to you other than maintaining legacy systems and maybe doing some obscure stuff in Delphi. It's really just a tool that is not very commonly used anymore. I think AI and LLMs are going to change some of the tools that we use eventually. Like, obviously, we're still with AI, still programming in Python and JavaScript and all that. It's just kind of a tool that we're leveraging to help us generate and understand that code. But at some point, the tools themselves will fundamentally change in one way or another. And it's important to stay on top of that. As a beginner, I would say it's probably best to mostly ignore it, because it's changing so fast, and eventually it won't change so fast. And you can't really build or learn on a foundation that's just changing under you all the time. And right now, we're using these LLMs to just work more efficiently with existing programming languages, and you can't do that if you have no idea what's going on. So you really should, your effort is better spent right now learning the underlying technologies that you'll be working with rather than learning the AI stuff. I mean, the caveat to that would be if you are very just singly focused on AI and you love AI and you think it's something that you want to pursue specifically, then learn AI and learn all the math behind AI and what makes AI tick. Just learning to use AI is not going to help you so much in that respect, but you'll have to probably learn Python or some other things, some matrix mathematics, like all the stuff that goes into making AI in order to be effective as like that kind of foundational AI developer.
The role of a kind of software developers as a kind of role that's not going to kind of become less important or die anytime soon, right? Like, what do you, I mean, presumably, yeah, they may end up working at a kind of high abstraction levels, but you still need to know how to use the whatever tools or whatever new technologies are going to be developed, right?
Yeah, and we also, our entire like economy is built on legacy code, and it always has been. So even if everybody starts using the context windows for working on million-line code base are just infeasible right now, right? Like if you can't tell an AI to develop a feature for the Windows kernel or something like that, right? It's just too much. We're going to need humans for at least another few decades, even if everything that people say comes true.
Do you think this is my personal opinion, I think and maybe it's a slightly contrarian just because of the way people are saying, oh, developers are going away, but I think it's actually even more useful now to learn technical skills, because if this is a boost to your productivity, right? It's not like with this new capability of creating more in the same amount of time. It's not like companies are going to demand the same output by using less people. They're just the whole output should technically increase. It's even more beneficial, I think, now that you can direct these AIs to kind of increase your output, and it's probably more useful to learn to code than ever. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very much the same way, that it's really just a lever that you can use to amplify your productivity.
What about, I wanted to ask a couple slightly more involved kind of questions behind the scenes of using these AIs to build an AI tool or something. So free to jump in and if I'm going in a particular direction. So when you have these AIs and you build these agents, you end up with AIs talking to AIs. So you kind of end up with maybe amplifying these problems of hallucinations. And because once you use it and then you send it on to the next one, there's this new non-deterministic factor that we never had to deal with before. So you had problems with concurrency, random network failures, whatever. There wasn't non-determinism, but not in this way where the logic itself is a little bit now. Code used to be rigid before you use an LLM along inside of your tool. So what's been your experience with this? Like what do you think about it?
Well, I haven't deployed any AI really, so I don't have experience with this problem. But in my sort of experiments with AI to solve some of the small problems that I've been trying to solve, it just hasn't been reliable enough to deploy it at all, right? Like most of the problems that I work on, I like to have deterministic results. I've tried to use them for some natural language parsing stuff, and sometimes the answers are just wrong, but it doesn't give me any indication that the answer might be wrong. The only way for me to know whether the answer is wrong or not is to have some other oracle that can solve the problem without AI, in which case I've already built a better solution. If I can parse the text deterministically and know whether it's right or wrong, then I don't need the AI for anything anymore.
Right. In my experience, it's, if you don't have to use it, it's better not to. But there are things that are just almost, it feels trivial for it to solve. You know, for instance, like a typical example is what you said, like sort of extracting unstructured data. It's just much better than you writing some rigid logic to do this because you're dealing with chaos a little bit, you know.
It's always great at that kind of thing, but there's always going to be things that are subtly wrong. So if it
Right.
if it matters that the answer is correct, then you're going to have a bad time, right? But if you're just having it say summarize documents, if the other end of that equation is like a person that's going to be able to judge whether it makes sense, then that's fine. But if the result is like like a yes no answer and it says the wrong thing 20% of the time, then it's not going to be a tool that you have a lot of confidence in.
Have you had experience with, I think people, I guess they use AI now even for, like how does this impact interviewing? I think feel like everything is now polluted by this. Like people use AIs to write the resumes, to reply to your emails, to submit the solutions to your coding tasks. Like what's been the impact there, do you think?
I mean, it definitely seems like it's kind of polluting a lot of these spaces. I get plenty of AI spam one way or another. I'm currently kind of retired other than my nonprofit work and some open source stuff. So I'm not seeing it in the hiring pipeline just because I'm not part of that pipeline right now. But just as like a user of the internet, it's hard not to see it everywhere. Like if you go on any social media platform, there's all these like engagement farming bots that just like post random stuff just to game the metrics. It's really kind of just creating a lot of slop out there, and it's making the internet less useful for everyone, which is sad. And hopefully, we find ways to do something about it, whether it's detecting things or legislation or some combination of all of these things to kind of combat the AI slop problem.
Hmm.
And like you said before, when you have these agents interacting with each other, another problem is when the training sets include output from AIs and it starts like putting these hallucinations into its model, and it won't necessarily know what's right or wrong anymore because it treats anything that it reads on the internet as a fact, which a lot of people do too, which is a different problem. I don't know if there's ever going to be a general solution to this, but it's just something that people have to actively defend against and learn to do your research and learn to judge whether something seems trustworthy or not. We're lucky that when it's programming related, you can audit the code and run it in a sandbox and see what it does without causing a lot of harm, or like just other disinformation is a little harder to verify.
Yeah. Do you think AI aside, if you were, today interviewing, and it doesn't have to be, taking into account AI and everything else, it's just generally, if you were interviewing, let's say junior developer and like what would you, how would you, what would you look for and how would they sort of be set up to kind of perform?
What I've always liked to do for interviewing developers at any level is to provide them a problem to solve using like kind of normal tools. And I try and make sure that those problems are relevant to what we're actually doing in the business. But it definitely takes time, like your time, to come up with good interview questions. But it certainly saves you a lot of time and headache later on because you know that this person is able to solve and understand problems that look very much like your day to day at work, right? Whereas if you're doing something based on hacker rank or a whiteboard problem, you're testing a skill that may not be correlated with what you're doing at work. So being able to come up with a sort of self-contained sandboxed environment where this developer can work on something that's very similar to a work problem, whether you give them the scaffolding and they're filling in kind of the blanks, or whether you give them something that's subtly broken and they have to debug it and fix it. And ideally, you're able to do this live with them. You create problems that don't take them a whole weekend to solve, something that they can work on during the interview for that half hour, hour, or however long it is. And you can be there with them and also provide that kind of mentor support, right? They can ask you questions, because if they were at work, they'd be able to ask somebody questions. And you also see how they work. Are they so stubborn that they won't ask any questions and just sit there and be stuck? Like, that's probably not somebody that you want to hire, right? So if you can just kind of simulate the work environment as much as possible, I think that's the best way to interview.
Tips for folks who just want to get into that step, so let's say you can set up a sandbox environment and kind of project that's relevant to the company only for 20 people, but you're lucky enough to get 1,000 applications. How what should the 1,000 think about to maximize chances of even being able to do kind of the project stage or get to that stage?
I think that these days it can be very hard to get there. With the way that companies really kind of ramped up during COVID and then recently ramped down. There are so many people looking for work right now that I have no idea how to best get noticed and to get into that pipeline. I think that's going to be a very hard problem, especially with junior developers, right? Our industry has really done junior developers a disservice for, probably almost as long as I've been doing software development. Like, I was lucky to get an internship in high school. I know very few startups that have any sort of internship programs, let alone would hire a high school student for an internship, right? I think a lot of it should really be on our end to provide more opportunities for juniors and interns to get into the industry. It shouldn't be just on the top companies to provide a few internships. It should really be up to all of us to provide opportunities and training for junior developers. And I've done what I could at the startups that I've been at. I've always had interns one way or another and tried to provide mentoring and stuff. But, I don't scale. I don't know what the solution to this problem is. We really need more companies to take on junior developers and be willing to train them. Even if some of them leave after a year or 2 years after you train them, then there are other problems in your business, right? You're not promoting people, or it's not a good place to work. But if you provide a good place to work, then you can hire people early on in their career and they'll stay for a few years. I mean, that was my experience at Mochi Media and elsewhere. I've never trained somebody and had them leave and get a better job right away, right? Like, normally they stick around for a couple of years and then they go do other things. I haven't had the problem where, like, I'm wasting my time training people because they immediately go somewhere else because, maybe it's been a better place to work than average. I think that's a reason that a lot of people use to not hire junior people, but I don't think it's a valid one.
Did you, what are some, because you have a diverse experience with various team profiles, and what stands out about the environments where junior developers thrive the most?
I think it's really the communication style, where if you have an environment where there is enough communication going on that's observable to juniors, they can learn a lot from seeing how other people interact with each other. Like, if you have companies where all communication happens like direct message between individuals, then nobody else is learning anything from that conversation. Discussions on an issue tracker or in an open Slack channel or something like that, then other people can learn by observing. And I think that juniors especially get a lot from that. And just having an environment where it's okay to ask questions, where nobody like insults you for asking a question that they really quickly know the answer to just because they have more experience. Like you shouldn't make it an environment where people are afraid to ask questions, to ask for help. Um, just having that kind of patience and understanding for junior developers is really important.
Yeah, asking questions is just an example of, or not being scared of doing that is just an example of bias to action, which obviously in a startup, we all have lots of experience in a startup. Bias to action, not just for devs, but for everyone, is probably kind of one of the most important things. And maybe for junior developers who are perhaps more, relative to salespeople, marketing people, perhaps a bit more introverted, is that something you've tried to develop or improve in folks you've worked with or juniors at your company? How do you develop and improve bias to action?
I don't know if I've had a situation where I was intentionally trying to improve that, but I think one way is just to make sure the onboarding of somebody new is smooth, to make sure that you're paying more attention to somebody right when they're starting so that they know that they can ask questions. Like, maybe the first couple of weeks you proactively ask them, like, hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can help you with? Like, how are you feeling? That kind of stuff, rather than just giving them the employee handbook and the Git repository and say, go be productive. I think a little bit of that kind of mentorship and training at the beginning is helpful, not just training on the technical side, but also the work style side, company's culture, that this is kind of how we generally operate. Like, it's okay to ask questions. You're welcome to direct message me if you're not sure, but by default, maybe ask it in a public setting, that kind of thing.
What's been not just junior developers, but the best the best performing teams that you've been in and that you experience, like what is the general dev culture? How does that look in a great performing team?
I think the best performing teams that I've worked with have people that feel like kind of ownership over the project, whether it's just parts of the project or the whole project, where they are personally very interested in seeing that it's done well, rather than just like taking issues from a product manager and turning that into code, and I think that's the end of it. Like, I think that having some pride in the craft is very useful for productivity. I mean, maybe you're not churning out the most lines of code if you're spending a little time to make sure that it's good code. But I find that in the kind of medium to long term, it's better if the code is a little nicer.
I see. So what about in terms of, because you've managed a bunch of people over the years, what are some strong opinions or maybe even contrarian opinions that you've developed?
Well, I've always leaned more towards the CTO type roles because my brain really likes the puzzles and being in the weeds and debugging and architecture. And so the management I've always done more as like a necessity than something that I was very personally interested in. I think that in my case, the best I could do is provide a lot of mentorship to try and lead by example. Like, I think that um, being able to write code that they respect goes a long way. It's not an option that works for everybody, especially if you have a lot of reports. You might not have the time to be up to speed on all the code. But in my case, like, I just wouldn't be happy at a job if I couldn't understand the code. So I would find something else to do if that was the case. But Other than that, I think the only other kind of controversial opinion is that we need to be hiring more junior developers and interns. It's something that the industry just hasn't been doing. We're seeing a lot of the results of that in the way that it's really hard to hire people with expertise, and it's also really hard for juniors to get jobs. We
Yeah.
don't have anybody taking these risks and investing in training talent when we really should be.
I think maybe a healthier way to look at this, because I think it's getting in some way even stronger what you're saying, like even more difficult with AI to get a junior job, because there's this philosophy or this perspective that it's kind of a replacement for junior devs, which I actually don't think so. I think what it actually makes it makes it slightly easier, slightly more approachable to be a junior dev actually with this, and not it doesn't replace it necessarily. What do you think is the way to approach this?
Yeah, I think that as a junior, there's never been like a better time because the tools are so much better than they used to be. But that's really just from the technical side, right? From the people
Right.
side, like getting that job and being able to succeed in that environment. I don't know, it just anecdotally, that seems harder than it's ever been with the way the economy is at the current moment. So there's definitely pros and cons. I don't think AI is to blame for any of it. I think it's kind of larger socioeconomic issues to blame. But I think eventually AI will be a tool that helps juniors level up very fast. And certainly, in my experience, it won't replace juniors. Like it can replace some junior work, and it certainly produces results that often feel like a junior programmer wrote it. But I would rather have a person than an AI any day, right now, anyway.
I guess to circle back to the whole main topic, well, I guess one of the core topics of this whole conversation, like I wanted to ask, why do you you still have passion for this, you still enjoy this natural, like just this tinkering and building and this, this craft of coding. And what personally like makes it awesome for you, and like why should people do it,
Well, actually, and related to that, are you I mean, if you're a Thai boy, are you still tinkering on something, or kind of what's your yeah, just curious what you know from of things that you're interested in that got nothing to do with like kind of actually making money and kind of building companies. What's still there and going to continue for a while?
Um, well, I still contribute a fair bit to open source. Lately, um, I've been contributing to a rich text editor called Lexical out of Meta. I was doing a startup last year, and we were using it. The startup shut down, but I thought the library was interesting, and there were other good people contributing to the library. So it was an opportunity to work with good developers on an interesting project that I could do without having to worry about the rest of the things that happen when you take on a job. Um, and I think that, rich text editors are something that are very hard to build. And the ones that are out there right now are typically very tuned to one use case or another, and it's hard to make it do something else. Where I think the foundation for Lexical is pretty good for general use cases, and it's nice to have one that you can really tailor to your specific use case. And with the mode that people are using AI right now and just tools in general, I think that uh, this kind of technology is foundational to just have very nice rich text interfaces. They're a little more advanced than say ChatGPT's kind of markdown based thing. Um, so I find interesting. I do outside of programming, the thing that I do the most is ride bikes. So I I work on the website and some tools for my cycling team, some scraping to analyze our like race results and stuff like that. With Mission Bits, I'm the chairperson of the board, but I also help work on the website and do some plumbing stuff, like taking our donations, from the data from donations from various places and get it all into Salesforce and just help them integrate with APIs and stuff, because it's a very small core team that doesn't employ a lot of developers because we're focused on teaching the students. So I try and fill in some technology gaps there as well.
Right. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I wanted to ask, because one thing I want to ask about everything you just said is it's kind of obvious you still love doing this. And so why is that? Like, what makes coding awesome for you?
Well, for some of it, it's just because I want something to exist and it doesn't. Like the natural language processing thing that I worked on was that there's a cycling track in Golden Gate Park called Polo Field, and the Rec and Parks department used to have a very bad website for it where it was just kind of plain text rules of like, it's open from these hours on these days, except for this Wednesday and stuff like that. And they would change it all the time, but it was very hard to like read and understand it all. So I wrote. At first, I tried throwing AI at the problem, and then I was like, "Well, the AI is wrong here and there and this other place." And well, what do I do? Like, I can't like write special cases to fix the AI without a full understanding of the whole thing. So I ended up writing a parser that parses the whole thing in kind of like a parser combinator style. And I made a website that gave you a very easy to read schedule for the polo field. It's polofield.bike. It'll show you visually like what hours on which days it's open. And just like that kind of thing, right? Like where I'm just solving these little personal problems. The race results website for the USA Cycling is just awful. So I wrote some stuff to scrape it, what our team's results were, and put up the aggregate of results for the team. I mean, it's not high leverage, like nobody's making any money, but it's just something that I wanted to exist. So I made it, and you wouldn't be able to do it without programming because otherwise you would just be like copying and pasting things and it would be too much work for one person to want to do.
Do you think coding is like a superpower in that way? Like, obviously that's a little bit hyperbolic, but you kind of manifest things that you want that aren't there. You just build them. You could just do it.
Yeah, I mean, it could certainly be described as a superpower or just a power or a skill, right? Like, I wouldn't say that a carpenter has a superpower because they can build something out of wood, but they wanted it to exist, they made it exist, right? Like, I'm just doing the same thing for websites and data and whatnot. Like, I don't think it's that special. I think that would be quite a lot of hubris if I think what I'm doing is a superpower, but other jobs aren't.
Yeah, I guess having the organic kind of enjoyment for the craft is what it what makes it extra awesome, I guess, because you're doing this out of just your own needs without having the force of like getting a degree or a job or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of unique in that way. I don't think there's anything else in my life other than the basic life functions that I've been doing for over 30 years. It's been quite an all-encompassing hobby that turned into a profession that I was able to very luckily retire from, but I still do it anyway.
Awesome. I don't know if you guys we're at time. Do you guys have anything else you want to ask Bob? Bob, what's your time like?
Any questions? For me, the takeaway was I think it's pretty good advice for entrepreneurs as well who are building things. It's like if you don't already know what you want to exist that doesn't already, maybe have a think about, because that's maybe a great motivation to start building and learning whatever you need to learn to build that thing. Kat, any questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, just you mentioned you're part of the cycling club, I assume. So I was wondering what's like your average mileage.
It is cycling. My average mileage changes from week to week. These days, I've been doing about, say, 130, 140 miles a week. I used to do more, but this year I had some roadblocks with illness and crashed my bike in a race back in June. So that kind of had a few setbacks here and there, but on average, spending probably a little more than an hour a day riding bikes. I'm pretty happy about that.
Nice. I recently got into it as well.
Both you and I are kind of starting to get, or I guess, into bikes, and we got to get Carol on board now to kind of get started.
Well, if you're ever in the Bay Area, I'll be happy to show you around. We've got some great cycling here. Also up in Sonoma, I do a lot of cycling up there too. Bring a bike, rent a bike. If you're my size, I'll loan you a bike.
Nice. Looking forward to it.
Should we? I think that's time, right, guys?
Yeah, let's wrap up. Thanks very much, Bob. And Bob, do you want to share for anyone who's got this far, whether they can find you online or or how they can collaborate with you on any of your projects that you'll continue tinkering on or contributing to, or should they just hit you up for maybe a kind of a bike session somewhere in the Bay Area? How can folks find you online or elsewhere?
I mean, if you search for Bob Ippolito online, you'll find me. I'm in most of the places. My Strava is public. If you're trying to stalk my cycling activities, I'm on most of the social networks and whatnot. If you're trying to find me there, pretty open to DMs or whatever if you want to solicit some advice.
All right. Thanks very much, Bob. And
thanks for doing this, Bob.
And thanks for watching, everyone. Cheers.